last webinar for 2021. I'd like to welcome Dr. Chelsea Jarvis. Chelsea is a senior scientist at the University of Southern Queensland Centre for Applied Climate Sciences. She'll be speaking on communicating climate science to different industries. Welcome, Chelsea, and I'll let you probably introduce yourself a bit more fully than I have, and make your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Graham. Perfect. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. And the introduction is sort of part of the talk. So 2 birds, 1 stone. Okay, start that. There we are. Everybody can see that? Oh, there we go.
All good, Chelsea.
Right. Yep. So as Graham mentioned, I'm going to be talking about communicating climate sciences to different industries. It sounds like, oh, well, surely you just talk about it the same way, but it's actually can be different industries can be quite different. So a little bit about my background. I actually did an undergrad in geography and looked at a lot of soils, climate, vegetation, things like that, and how people interact with that. So that human factor has always been really important to me. And then I did my master's in viticulture and geography, and I studied at the University of California, Davis, which is right next to the beautiful Napa Valley, and lived in Napa for a little bit. And then I went on to do my PhD in viticulture and climatology at the University of Melbourne. So I have a pretty extensive background in viticulture, both here and in the US. But then when I finished, the wine industry was kind of full up, but the beef industry wanted me. So I signed on with the Northern Australia Climate Program, which had just started going then. It was 2018. And they're mostly funded by Meat and Livestock Australia. And the purpose is to communicate climate science to red meat producers across Northern Australia. Very different crowd than viticulturalists, as we'll find out. But it's been great with NACP. I'm still with them and really enjoying the role. And I lead the extension team for NACP without ever having prior extension experience, by the way, which some people said was maybe a good thing. I don't know. It's been a learning curve for sure. So wine and beef, perfect pairing, right? But it turns out I'm actually more of a champagne and sushi kind of girl. So maybe I'll go into fisheries next or something. So these are just some general lessons that I've learned in communicating climate science, and then we'll get more to industry-specific comparisons towards the end of the talk. So the first one is, it's going to sound really silly, but starting with the basics, like the number of people that don't even know the difference between weather and climate, or that think that when you talk about climate, you're only talking about climate change. It's like 90% of people out there who don't have an academic background. And so it's really important, like I tell my beef guys, I'm just like, look, our weather forecasting system and our climate forecasting system are like totally different. So it'd be like somebody from the city coming to you and saying, oh yeah, beef. Hey man, that's cool. Have you thought about chickens? And the beef producer would be like, well, no, why would I think about chickens? And they'd be like, this person from the city would be like, well, they're both animals, right? So it's nearly the same thing. Weather and climate, yeah, two quite different things. And so just even explaining simple things like that can help them. It can help people, straight from the get-go have a slightly deeper understanding of what we're going to be talking about. This kind of goes back to that as well. Reviewing any math, even really basic math, like the difference between an average and a median, because these are really important for understanding a forecast. And the main thing in communicating climate science, at least for me, is getting people to understand how to correctly read a forecast. And so starting what is median and what do we mean by that is really important, because if not, they have no frame of reference down the track. So, and making it not intimidating is also really important, because people seem to hear math and go, oh God, no, I was never good at that. But it's actually really useful. This one is very important for all those academics out there. I don't know if anybody's an academic, but using simple images and videos. So no complex charts. So this is an example of what I would call a complex chart. You put this up in front of a producer and they're like, I don't even know what's going on here. There's some blobs and it looks like a 3-year-old did it. And there's some funny letters. Is it talking about COVID? Are those all Greek letters there? But the number of scientists that come and talk to producers and are like, oh, this is very simple to understand. Let me just explain it to you. And it's not. Even when it's explained for whatever reason, doesn't work. But whereas something like this would be a really useful one because it's color coded, so red and blue, hot and cold. We have clouds that are very easy to understand. It's all spelled out. Everything's very nicely laid out. We can kind of ignore the suppressed upwelling that might throw somebody, but they can ignore that. And it's not that people are dumb, of course. It's just most people have been out of school for a really long time or maybe never had climatology. You know, why would you in most classes? So again, it's not that people can't understand it. It's a lot of new information. So just trying to keep it as simple as possible. Okay, so number 4 is using a local example. Again, the number of times I've been to a talk in, let's say, Georgetown, Queensland, so up on the Gulf, and somebody's talking about southern Queensland. I'm like, it's not going to fly with this crowd. So just being really, really conscientious of providing a local example, even if you're kind of covering a broad region, maybe putting in 2 local places or something. Sometimes I try to find out where my crowd is coming from ahead of time, so that way I can actually really pinpoint the locations that are most meaningful to them. And yeah, so just using a really local example is important. Kingaroy rainfall has declined over summer for the past 100 years, which we see is reflected in the peanut industry now struggling there. Okay, and then kind of following on to that is being prepared with a reality check. So lots of people, very normally, this is normal across the board, they like to remember the good things or the exciting things, and then they kind of forget the normal things. So for example, this is January last year, and we can see there are 3 black dots here. So one's Kingaroy, one's on the Downs, and one's someplace else. And you know, it's showing, so this is a forecast showing the chance of exceeding median rainfall was sort of 65 to 70%, so greater than 50%. And I went to Kingaroy in February, and I showed this to people, and I said, hey, look at this, you know, this forecast was, you know, it showed above average rainfall, and turns out you got above average rainfall. And they're like, no, we didn't. It's been terrible here. And I'm like, well, we have data that shows. And this was like the first time, well, not the first time that this happened, but the first time that this did happen to me, I was like, oh, shoot, okay, sorry. So, because one person's like, oh, look, I'm to the north of Kingaroy, we didn't get anything. And another person's like, oh, I'm to the south, we didn't get anything. Person from the east, person from the west. And I'm just like, wait a minute. So you're telling me that rain only fell exactly at the rain gauge? And they're like, yep. And that has happened to me in so many places. So I don't think it's true. Some people do get it and some people do miss it. That's absolutely true. But pretty much everywhere I go, if people like to deny that they've gotten rain, or if they don't get as much as they think that they should have, then it's like they didn't get what was forecasted, even if the forecast is for the median and they got greater than the median. If it's not as much as they wanted, it's a weird mental psychological thing. So anyway, the moral of the story is it's always good to understand what actually happened in that region. So that way, when you're talking about it and people say, oh no, we didn't get any rainfall, you can pop up the data and be like, well, actually you did. Because they like to say, oh, this forecast wasn't right or whatever. And so, yeah, it's just good to go in with a bit of data so you can back up your position. This is a bit of a busy slide. That's usually a no-no, but apologies. So using the metric and time frame relevant to the area and industry. So this is for Charters Towers, showing the Southern Oscillation and how it impacts rainfall. I was showing this to cattle producers. So cattle producers are interested in rainfall. This is rainfall November to January. That's a time frame that cattle producers are interested in rainfall in. It's in Charters Towers, which I know is an area that's impacted by the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So therefore, the Southern Oscillation Index was a useful metric to use. And so it ticks off all the boxes. You know, going to the far north and talking about winter rainfall or something silly like that can really shut off a crowd. Or, you know, talking about like, oh, how much rain did you get in June? They're like, none. So just understanding things like that and about your industry. So for example, the wine industry, temperature is more important. Yes, rainfall is important, but they mostly want to talk about temperature. So understanding those things about your industry. Sorry, I had a slide about it. Yep, so anyway, so this is for the wine industry, just showing, so they actually are really interested in spring and summer temperatures, especially maximum temperatures. And this is just showing different phases of the IOD, the Indian Ocean Dipole. Yeah, so just the difference between beef and wine and using a relevant metric. And also pointing out regional differences. So it's not even just the industry, you know, we can see like in the Margaret River region over here on the West Coast, not really impacted by these negative IOD phases, but very impacted by the positive phases. So even just having those sorts of subtle, you know, it's like, yes, the Indian Ocean Dipole impacts most wine regions, as we can see on these two maps, but some of them will be affected differently in different phases. So things like that. Okay, science-based media is often confused with other media. It's a real issue. The media doesn't help us at all as scientists. They need to sell papers. So their headlines, gosh, I saw one, I took a photo of it on my phone. It was for probably the Daily Telegraph or something similar. And it was 2 weeks ago, and it was all about like La Nina already bringing life-threatening floods and catastrophic cyclones. And it was very like, oh my God, like the world's going to end. Yes, there was already flooding, and I get that, but it was just way over the top. And that's what they do. But then somebody sees that headline and they read it, and in their mind, when you're talking to them later, they're like, oh, look, the bomb said we're supposed to have major flooding and cyclones. And I was like, are you sure that was the bomb that said that? Oh yeah, it's definitely the bomb. And no, it wasn't. But pretty much anything that anybody says, it's always the bomb. So just something to keep in mind about that. Also, I don't know if anybody knows this, but lots of producers listen to the ABC radio, and they'll get their weather from there. And the ABC radio actually gives a regional weather forecast, and it's usually for the forecast of the largest of the town with the largest population furthest east. So if you have a really big region, let's say sort of the Downs, you know, almost out to the border, probably not quite that far, but they'll take the regional rainfall or whatever for Toowoomba, but people in, I don't know, let's say Roma might be hearing that forecast, and they might be very different forecasts. And so I just tell producers just to be aware of those regional forecasts, because they don't always mean for their specific town. It might actually be for an area that's quite far away, and especially for thunderstorms and stuff that maybe only impact a 5 by 5K area. It can be really misleading. So I just direct them to the bomb. Okay, any questions there on lessons learned across the board? Yep. Okay. So just the different. Yep.
Chelsea, Graham Harris here.
Mm-hmm.
So you've obviously worked in both the wine and beef industry. You'll probably will cover this a bit further here. I've got difference between industries, obviously. Yeah. Are you seeing any change in attitude have you seen a change in attitudes towards Bureau of Meteorology forecasts, seasonal forecasts from amongst producers you've been working with over the period of time that you've been working? Has there been any change, or is it still a heavy dose of skepticism expressed?
That's a really good question. And I think we have two major factors. So I work in Queensland, Northern Territory, and Northern Western Australia. So that's sort of the areas that I'm talking about. When the forecast is for rain and it rains, people then are likely to believe in it from there on out. If the forecast is for rain and it doesn't rain, they won't believe in it anymore. And overall, probably the people that I talk to are already kind of interested in climate stuff, and but there definitely is a pretty healthy dose of skepticism around the bomb. I think it's probably getting slightly better. I do, and I always try to, you know, point out like, oh, look, the bomb just updated to the new system in October, so keep an eye on it. It's, you know, we can see improvements since the past system and since POAMA, which is, you know, way back, there have been great improvements. So if you looked at it 20 years ago and it was terrible, give it a chance. It's always evolving. So I just encourage them to kind of look again. But yeah, but sort of like that area from pretty much Gympie up to Townsville this year, we lost a lot of people on the forecast there because it kept saying wet, and then it was just massively dry last year for them. So things like that can really throw a wrench into the works.
Okay, I'll keep going.
Just
Chelsea?
to comment on
sorry.
ABC. Yeah, I was just wondering, because maybe ABC needs to think about how they do this more broadly, because it's no longer appropriate to have a regional forecast. Whereas if you go on the bomb, I mean, as a kid, they used to say scattered showers, and we would say scattered around Bartle Frere. So, you know, I think they need to think about how they present this more clearly. So if I want to look at the chances of rain on Wednesday afternoon for bomb, I go and look at the specifics area and look at the probabilities, and they're quite often right. The other thing is, I think that it's easier to predict dry. Rainfall predictions are much more problematic in my experience. I don't know if this is actually true, but that's just my perception of it.
I fully agree with you. And yeah, I don't know if it's entirely true either, but I'm 99.9% sure that it is, because it makes sense. Like, you know, it's easier to predict no rain than it is to say, oh, look, we're going to get 10 to 20 or 20 to 50 or, you know, a specific amount. And also the patchy thunderstorm thing, like a region overall might get what the forecast predicted, but, you know, this pasture got it and this pasture didn't. And that's just the nature of storms. Whereas when things are dry, it's just dry everywhere usually. So no, I think that you're right there. And I do tell producers that. And so I always, especially for the beef industry up north, it's really important for them to respond to dry times, even more so than wet times usually. So I tell them, like, if they see a forecast and it's just all, you know, red and yellow and whatever, indicating a very low chance of exceeding median, especially for that November to January timeframe, I say, look, don't count on any rain. If you get it, it's a bonus, but trust that forecast. Don't trust the pretty blue one that indicates, you know, chance of exceeding median. You can completely ignore that one if you want to, but trust the one that's really dry. And producers like that because they want something that's really cut and dry usually. And at a glance, that's an easy thing to do.
Okay, thanks, Chelsea.
Good questions. Okay, I'll go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so now getting a bit more into the nitty gritty between industries. It's probably going to seem pretty obvious, but I thought it was pretty interesting. So the wine industry, especially boutique wines, wineries, so smaller ones, many of the people who own them or manage them, but especially the owners, they come from a different job or industry, lots of lawyers and doctors and things like that who spent a lot more time studying after high school. So they've been in academia or in sort of an educational system for a lot longer, which I think helps, not always, but can help to sort of keep their brains on that track of understanding reports and forecasts and things like that. Lots of them trust science a lot more than beef producers. And then there's less of this country-city divide. So, you know, maybe they've had a doctor's office in Melbourne, and then they bought a vineyard in the Yarra, and there's no real country-city divide for them. They move between both spaces pretty easily. To make a small fortune in wine, start with a bigger one. So most of them are fairly wealthy. Usually, not all of them. Obviously, some people, you know, came into it other ways, but that kind of plays into it. And they're really attached to the idea of terroir, and they like actually that expression and paying attention to how their vineyard changes from year to year. Like, it's very much part of the wine story. And so it's something that they just do as part of the business. They want to notice those changes. So they're all about subtleties, totally into it. The northern beef industry, on the other hand, it's much more that they've inherited or married into the industry as opposed to having another profession and then gone into it. Again, these are generalizations. There are plenty of other ways to get into it, but that's what I've noticed. Some of them go to university afterwards, but it doesn't seem to be quite as prolific as, let's say, in the wine industry. Many learn from their family from an early age, so they do have sort of this ongoing knowledge. That can both be great because they know so much, but then also they can sometimes pick up bad habits from their parents. So if if the parents didn't like the bomb, maybe the kids won't like the bomb either, or something like that. So it can be a bit of an uphill battle. Obviously, there's a general, maybe it's not obvious, there's a general wariness of cities and science and the bomb manipulating data, whatever that means. And there seem to be a lot more sort of conspiracy theories. I don't know if it's like a small town thing or what, knowing that I grew up in a small town. But yeah, there just seems to be a bit more wariness and wanting to question things and all of that. And of course, decisions are very emotional for cattle producers. Like they love their animals, they love their land. And so, just being like, well, look, we're going into drought. You should sell part of your herd. They're like, I've worked for years breeding, building up this breeder herd. I'm not going to sell it. Whereas a wine person might be like, yep, okay, we're just going to drop the fruit. No problem. It's a different, emotional investment usually. So what does this mean for talking to these two different groups? So for the wine industry, the majority of the wine industry are accepting and adapting climate change. They see that their grapes are ripening earlier every year. They can see, the impacts of warmer air, things like that.
Attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Somebody's having one of those alarms. A lot of them document when they harvest or when the vines ripen or things like that. So they have really long-term records. And even if that particular winery doesn't, you can actually just get online and look at records from France from like the 1600s. Like it's insane. And just see really long-term records of how wine grape growing has changed. Many grape growers are already buying property in cooler regions. Again, they don't necessarily have that attachment to being in one place. They're happy to move to a different place and continue their grape growing there for the quality that they need, whereas beef producers don't really want to move. And they're willing to plant different types of cultivars that can handle the heat and put an investment there. So they're willing to change, which I think beef producers do that as well. Anyway, for the beef side, it's a lot easier to talk about climate variability rather than climate change. You say climate change and most people go, no, don't want to know about that. But if you talk about climate variability, if you say, hey, has your rainfall changed? Have you noticed? They go, yeah, rainfall's changed. So it's just funny that, you can talk about rainfall changing, but not temperature changing, especially in the north. Like, oh, it's always been hot up here. Now it's getting hotter. So the second point is cattle are bought and sold regularly. So you don't have those long-term records like you do in the wine industry. And it's not quite as easy to see timing changes or shifts of things like that. Producers tend to prefer, cattle producers like to think of things as cycles. So they think, oh, yes, it's been dry, but the rain's going to come back. Yes, it's been hot, but it's going to be cold. And so there's no real linear change. It's all very cyclic. And I think that that's a kind of a barrier in accepting climate change as well. Lots of them, I think, have chips on their shoulders. They feel that lots of city people blame cattle producers for causing greenhouse gas through cutting down forests and farting cows or something. And they take that very personally, which I understand, fully understand that. So that can be a barrier as well. They have stronger ties to the land, so they're less likely to pack up their cattle and move someplace else. Whereas in the wine industry, people are already buying property elsewhere. It's funny, I was talking to back to the peanut producer in Kingaroy, and he's like, oh, look, do you think my peanut crops the past few years have just gotten so variable, and I never know if I'm going to get a good crop and all this stuff. What do you think I should do? And I'm like, you should move to the Northern Territory. He's like, no, we're really attached to this land. And I'm like, okay. So, and a lot of producers are like that. They want to stay where they are. That's where their family is. That's where their friends are. They don't want to move. Feedlots. So within the industry, things can be a bit different. So feedlots are pretty dialed in. They understand increasing temperatures. Probably live export does as well. So there are segments that do. So in sum, always start with the basics. including any sort of data or explanation of percentiles. Anything that ends in "ile" gotta explain really well. Pictures and videos that are really simple. The climate kelpies, I don't know if anybody uses those. Everybody loves the climate kelpies. Age doesn't matter. Love the climate kelpies. Complex graphs and stuff, even if you take the time to explain it, like as you're halfway through explaining it, people have already clocked out. Local data, examples and pictures. So, you know, if you're way up north, don't show Angus, you know, from down south. Don't like that. People have selected memories, so it's good to know whatever the local conditions are. This is that example where they're all claiming they didn't get rain, but you look around and there was rain. So just doing a reality check. Using the metric that's relevant for the industry. Being really careful around media and just gently correcting, like, oh, did you hear that from the bomb? Because I don't think that they would have written that. Or, are you sure that was from the bomb? Maybe it was from here. Things like that. And acceptance of climate change will vary a lot by industry, even within industry. I actually wonder if cattle producers in the South are more willing to talk about climate change. I don't know if anybody can tell me about that. But there are other ways to talk about climate change. If people aren't open to that, you can talk about climate variability or rainfall change or something like that they're much more open to, so that you don't get that door shut straight away. Okay, this is my last slide. Just for anybody who doesn't know, I always show this slide. It's how it is. Oh, somebody's drawing on my slides. Anyway, so this is from the BOM. This is their 7-day rainfall forecast from Med-Eye. It looks exactly the same as the Elders or Woollyweather one. This is for Innisfail, because it always rains in Innisfail, Queensland. I'm pretty sure it's owned by the mob. I don't know if anybody's ever been up there, but yep. Okay, so here on Thursday, we see that there's a 100% chance of rain, and the rainfall range given is 10 to 30 millimeters. And so 99.9% of people look at this and go, ah, that means there's a 100% chance of 10 to 30 millimeters. And then they get 5 millimeters and they go, oh, bloody bomb. Nope, so it's a 100% chance of 0.2, and it's always that. So on the next day, it's 95% chance of 0.2, 90% chance of 0.2 on Sunday, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a 50% chance of 10 and a 25% chance of 30. So the next day, there's a 50% chance of 8 and a 25% chance of 15. So whenever you talk to anybody about this, even if it's just your fishing buddy, please tell them how to read this, because it is not intuitive. Thank you.
Chelsea, thank you for that. My apologies for the fire alarm test. Timing's always good, always good. Small group of people here, so we'll open the floor to questions. We've got a range of industries represented here. Oh, haven't we, Noel? Horticulture.
Everybody's horticulture?
I am, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what Roy works across a few things, I think.
Oh, across a few industries and a few places other than Australia too.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a question for you, Roy. What's been your experience with the equivalent Bureau of Meteorologies internationally? How active are they? How accurate are they? Or how much do people look to them for advice or not, from your experience?
People tend to get it from, if they get it at all, from their mobile phones or from their neighbours.
Yep.
I don't think they tend to they just don't have access to something like BOM.
No.
And to be honest, I've never looked at it, because quite often it's in another language.
That's right.
And while I understand a bit of an Indonesian, I don't understand much Bangla or the other languages.
Okay.
So is their app on their phone just like the Apple weather one, or whatever the one that comes on their phone is?
Look, most smallholder farmers wouldn't have that. They're lucky if they have a 3G phone. A lot of them have a 2G phone.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, their phone is one of the ones with buttons, which are great for texting, and that's about it.
Again, a little bit back to the question I had before. Do you see much change, or do you see any geographical differences occurring even within the beef industry? What you've observed, because you've been working in the northern beef industry.
Yeah, I'd say it's really interesting because a lot of so demographically, what I see, Queensland,
Yep.
much older demographic in beef production than Northern Territory or WA. And so the people coming into beef production in Northern Territory and WA actually tend to be quite a bit more open to talking about climate change, whereas in Queensland, I get a lot of pushback. But again, the demographics are very, very different from what I see. Also, interesting to know, most of the rainfall projections for, well, at least the Catherine BRD and into the Kimberley Pilbara and the Gascoyne a bit, they're all for increased rainfall. So people are like, yeah, hey man, cool.
We like that.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas for, southern Queensland, it's less rainfall, and people are like, I don't want to believe that. It's like the same as believing that bomb forecast for chance of exceeding median versus bomb forecast for dry. They don't want to believe the dry one. They want to believe the wet one.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
So, but yeah, it's a big demographic thing for sure.
And you alluded to the change in the wine industry. I know there's been quite a bit of purchasing of country into Tasmania and people moving, wine industry moving into there. So that's interesting, that observation, and the observation of the different, different thinking, that's occurring between the two industries is an interesting observation.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's going to be tough, I think, for some producers, whether in beef or what else, where they're having less and less rainfall and it's becoming less and less dependable, but they don't want to move. They just want to keep trying to make it work and keep trying to make it work. And, even switching from something like peanuts to beef is like a massive undertaking. Like, you wouldn't know anything about beef if you were third generation peanut farmer. So yes, they want to stay there,
especially at the price of cattle at the moment.
That's it. You're like, oh hell, we just get them and we just chuck them in a field, right? Like, that's all we need to do.
Prices have gone up though.
So crazy. Yeah. So it's interesting to see, that moving versus not moving and being able to adapt very easily. So, we'll just move operations down to Tasmania and we do the same thing. Yes, we need to understand what the local climate is like, but at least it's all in the same realm. Whereas if you don't want to move, the options are much different.
So Chelsea, with the DCAP program and the climate change, so specifically you deliver workshops. Are there any other activities like the climate champions, or what other approaches are used to engage people from an extension perspective in this climate change and understanding climate forecasts?
Yeah, so I have 16 climate mates or climate champions, but we call them climate mates. Yep. That work across Northern Australia. They're just 1 day a week, but essentially they already were located in their local community. They all had a knowledge of some part of the beef industry. I mean, one was from shipping, whereas others they live on their own properties as well. So lots of variety, and sort of half are producers themselves, and then the other half are actually NRM. So they're 4 days a week with their local NRM and then 1 day a week with us, but it actually integrates really well. It's an excellent model if anybody is thinking about hiring local extension officers, to contact their local NRM, because essentially it does double duty for us. They talk to producers all the time, and then they can just insert that climate information into whatever else they're talking about. So really, really useful.
So how long has that been in operation? Since 2018 or later?
Yeah, a bit later. So they were hired pretty much in like August 2018.
Okay.
And then because we hired them for their beef knowledge, they didn't have a lot of climate knowledge. So it took about, like, we did a massive training at the beginning, but it was probably too much, but kind of 6 months to really get into it.
So what approach did you use to get people on board with understanding some of the science? Because it is pretty complicated climate science, to say the least. I mean, you did all up, full-on workshop thing, which is probably too much. What sort of support is provided for the climate mates into the future?
So they have myself. I'm full-time and a climatologist. We also have Damien O'Sullivan, who's based out of Kingaroy, Daff, who's knows a lot about climate and beef, so they can call him. We also, because we have project partners at the BALM, they can actually email the BALM researchers directly,
Okay.
which has actually proved to be really useful. And the BALM actually loves going out to our field days and workshops and stuff and presenting.
Okay. Okay. No, that's interesting. Have we any other questions? Jeff, you've been very quiet there. I'm not sure you can unmute yourself. No, he's not going to. He's busy.
Graham,
Noel,
yeah,
yes.
look, I'm interested in the concept of risk. And how, I mean, the sort of concepts of, yeah, you mentioned the sort of move from discussions of change to variability, and variability then comes into probabilities and risks. And I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts about those sort of terms and the best way of presenting information on risk or variability.
Yeah, really good question. In the beef industry, producers are, and I would guess it's probably the same in the wine industry, people are really comfortable talking about risk. Because if they go to their bank and want money, the bank will look at risk. And so people talk about risk or risk management, big thing. Yeah, so I find people are really confident about that. It's interesting though, because it's like somehow they can understand a risk and a chance of, you know, beef prices going up or down and are happy to take that risk. But somehow the risk of trusting a climate or weather forecast is perceived differently. They don't equate them. And they always want the climate forecast to be right. And when it's not, they're upset. But if they take a punt on cattle prices and they're wrong, yeah, it's just how it is. Yeah, so it's a really interesting topic. But I find them quite happy to talk about risk. However, I would say the one caveat is that it can be really difficult to talk about risk that only happens once every like 5 years, because they have so much going on day to day, and they're, you know, looking at weather forecast day to day, and then I want them to talk about climate forecasts of 3 months, and then to talk about like an extreme event that maybe only happens once every 5 years but will cause millions of dollars in damage, can be really tricky because they only have so much room to worry about stuff. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, I guess I've worked in the wine industry before, actually based at Kingaroy at one stage, but mainly working out of Adelaide with the national wine industry. But these days I work with exporters, and risk is always a discussion we have. And it is that sort of likelihood versus impact type thing, as you say. Some of them are small risks, and they can put in place pretty simple measures to help monitor and manage that risk. But yeah, the bigger ones are very hard to predict and hard to sort of gauge against. And yeah, pandemics probably falls into that basket.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear that, because that's absolutely exactly the same, whether it's export or whatever, those bigger risks that are longer term but can have massive impacts. People don't really want to manage for them as well as, oh yes, we can do this, and then that takes care of that.
Yeah, but part of that is also then they like to use the word diversification. To diversify the risk, to spread that risk to multiple markets, to different parts of the operation. So there's different terms that often have a little cut through.
Yeah, diversification's easy to talk about with the beef industry as well. Although some like business advisors, they'll say diversification doesn't work. Like if you do cattle, don't try to go into crops or something, because again, the knowledge thing. But with you, it's obviously just different markets. So that would work really well for beef. Like, look, we've been selling to China, but now we want to diversify into someplace else. So,
I mean, there's some good work done on risk and how people make these sort of decisions, and relying on the BOM stuff is people are less don't like to be wrong when they make a positive decision based on something like that. So it's the same with in many industries with using futures markets. They would rather not use the futures market and just rely on the price going up and down, because that's what they're used to, than making decision based on a prediction about the futures market and getting it wrong. It's a well-known way people behave. The other issue is what you're talking about. And when you talk about risk in the short term, that's sort of almost it's a different type of way you have to behave to account for the longer term things. That's strategic risk, and I call that uncertainty. And so you need to look at strategies for managing a whole lot of things that you have no chance. What you don't know what's going to hurt. It's the unknown unknowns, the unknowns, as I hate to use to promote Donald Rumsfeld, but he was right when he talked about the unknown unknowns. And those are the ones that are strategic. And COVID is not really an unknown unknown, but there have been situations like a number of years ago when the fuel in light aircraft gummed up the engines. That was not even thought about. The collapse of the reserve price scheme,
Yes.
I talked to all producers about that. We should have thought about it, but there was nobody had any papers on the collapse of the reserve price scheme. So nobody had considered it. So those sort of things they have to be handled strategically. And so if you want to talk about and I hate to use the word climate change, because that was developed by the people funded by the fossil fuel industry, because we were talking about global warming.
I thought it was the other way around. I thought global warming was. No.
We had global warming first, but the fossil fuel industry and the right-wing think tanks in the US used the term climate change because it was less scary. You'll notice the Guardian uses global heating because they want to make it sound scary. So you know, this is the whole issue, and it is about warming, really. I mean, there are other issues, you know, like rainfall in Western Australia, where I was. Rainfall on the university farm, our growing season rainfall dropped from about 350, 375 to 250 over a period of 20 years. And it was going down when I left there, and it's still going down. So that's a different issue. You know, rainfall is only part of the issue. It's the heating that's the real issue. Anyway, there's different ways of dealing with risk that are strategic rather than tactical. And my view is that if you want to, and that's what the wine industry are doing by shifting to Tasmania. They're addressing the issue strategically.
Yep.
Okay, so there are tactical responses. If you look at some of the issues of, I don't like the word risk, because I define risk as a situation where you know the probabilities and the distribution of the probabilities, whereas uncertainty is where you don't know those things or don't have a good handle on it. But in any case, if you want to deal with uncertainty, that's where you deal with it at a strategic level. And if you deal with that at a strategic level, which includes diversification, then you can look at the more tactical level. Things become less problematic. You know, you can be more risk neutral in your dealing with tactical responses if you've handled the strategic level decision making well. Anyway, that's
good, Roy. Thanks for that. Chelsea, do you have any questions of us? We're just about up to time now. So any questions of APEN? We didn't have a large audience here, but it will go out on a video in YouTube. So any questions of us?
Yeah, I guess, you know, in your experience that, you know, we kind of have briefly talked about, how do you, in your extension work, I'm assuming that everybody does extension, how do you get people interested
in
showing up or in listening or in even reading a pamphlet, opening an email? Maybe you don't do that. Maybe that's not part of the stuff that we do.
No, we do. Well, I haven't. We do.
Yeah, we do. I guess above anything, whenever you're trying to run an event or set up a program, you really need to be addressing an issue that has been as seen by your audience as being important. The climate change one's an interesting one because some people do not see that as important. They do see it as challenging, and they do see that the finger is being pointed at them, and the beef industry is one that comes to mind, particularly at this point in time. It's interesting. I mean, I can point to producers who are adamant climate change is happening. I can point to the same producer and same producer say it's definitely not happening. So it is a personal perception. But it's and again, you've got the full gamut of people who see that it's man-made, others say it's totally not man-made. You get the whole range of things. At the end of the day, you've got to deal with what's in front of you, and you've got to look at your business and see what are the challenges for your business going forward. If it stays dry, it becomes too wet. In fact, a classic year this year, our biggest issue this year has been too much rain. Has happened at the harvest time, which has happened before. When we've had good crops, it does happen. And we're certainly suffering from that now. So we have more issues probably in the wetter years than we actually do have in the dry years. Although drought is always fundamental in people's minds when they've been hit by drought. But as I said, we've had our areas in Texas this year, down in the south, we've had several years of drought, followed by 2 floods in one 12-month period. And so we've suffered the impact of those. So it's interesting. It's always challenging, but it's really what people see as being the issues that are of importance to them and their families and their business. That really is the key thing.
Chelsea, it reminds me that about 10 years ago at Curtin University, a project under the previous government, Gillard government before they were kicked out, did a project on drought, looking at training and stuff for farmers on drought. And they did address a farmer need in that project, or the way they did it was very participatory in the way they approached it, and had a lot of farmers take it up. So I can get you in touch with John Noonan. In fact, he's going to ring me probably after this finishes sometime today. And it was interesting. So 101 of extension is, I always try and start with addressing a farmer's need, what they think is important. Don't give the stuff what I think is important to start off with. Unless I address what they think is important, I'm not going to have any credibility. So, and that's the trouble with climate, global heating, is that they don't see it as important necessarily. So you can't just get them to come along to something like that easily. You have to find an angle or add it on to something. As Jeff, I don't know if that's Jeff Coots or Jeff somebody else. Jeff Coots found when they were doing some stuff in Ayr, he went back to his old hometown. They had a group of sugarcane farmers in a shed, and then they talked about something that was conservation as part of the stuff they were really interested in. Okay. The other thing was that it was interesting, they, in this one that John Noonan and et al. Ran, they had a session on climate change, and they changed the people's attitudes towards it, or at least some proportion of it, for a while. But when they went back to them after a year or two, the views had changed back because they'd gone back into the community, and the community had changed their views back. So they were no longer really any different from the general. So they, from the start, they changed out, and then they went back into the community because there was no more people supporting them in this.
Right. That's
so
really
it's a real issue. And as anybody knows, living in rural communities, if you have a view that doesn't fit with what the general population is, you keep your mouth shut, or you've got to be pretty brave to keep it open.
I agree with what the other two have said, Chelsea, in answer to your question. It's about recognizing the interests and needs of the audience that do change, getting feedback from them as much as possible, and certainly discovering ways of doing that, and then being able to pitch messages appropriately. So certainly recognizing that sometimes small grabs of information that can be delivered as videos and sent to people with the capacity to give feedback, and then following that, a series of those sort of things up with a more interactive session about what it means to them is probably the opportunity. So you don't try and, because you try and cover an hour information to people and then expect them to be having a lively discussion is often a real challenge because they're either stunned or they're put off or they disagree or anything. Yeah, but giving people time to look at stuff and decide what they agree with and what they don't is an important part of all this because there's such ingrained views.
Oh,
And also I'd follow up by saying the comment about graphs and figures is really important. I do prefer a 3-dimensional type of image than a 2-dimensional one. So any time.
And Chelsea, I would leave off the decimal points.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
You know, no decimal points. You're not that accurate. It's not that accurate.
We try to convince economists to do that, Roy, don't we? It's a challenge.
I haven't done that in a couple of weeks.
And scientists usually like 3 decimal points.
Three decimal points. Even when it's a survey.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
The other thing I've found, Chelsea, is I like box and whisker plots.
Yes.
You really?
Yeah, because farmers can understand the mean, the median, and the top and bottom and whatever. Because you really can't take in. I hate those distributional bloody CDF.
CDF.
I can't even understand them. And once you get more than 2 or 3 of them, your head, you know. So box and whisker plots, I've used them with farmers quite often because, you know, they can focus on that and you can explain the outer edges and you can explain. That makes much more sense to them than some of those other things.
Yeah, right.
Cumulative distribution function
on that. You'll have to give me a lesson on how to read the bomb bloody probabilities.
Yeah, that's always a good. That's always a good one because I've tended to fall into the same trap, Chelsea.
Yeah. And it's not clear from what they say.
No.
What it exactly means.
Well,
So
that's
to
how
me,
people
that's-
interpret them.
That's not to educate everyone about how to read the bomb. That's about educating the bomb on how to put out a decent
How to present it.
information. Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yes.
Chance of
That's
any rain. That's all you have to say.
Yeah.
Just put
Yes,
one word
Any
in it.
rain. Yeah.
And and fix up the actual volumes. I mean, that's just obviously just a mistake. You can't communicate that without an explanation. So fix it up.
But that's what comes on TV at night.
Yes,
too,
it does.
for the
It
local
does.
stuff.
It does.
And
It
they
does.
even simplify it further, and that gives a bad view to
Bad
people.
rap. Yeah.
Bad rap for the bomb.
And
So
that's-
we've complained to the bombs so much that they are changing it.
yeah. No,
And it's
that's-
not just us. I mean, so many people have. But so they're releasing a new website, I think in Q3 of next year. So they're currently beta testing it, and they're changing that whole course and how it's.
All we need
Good
now is to
extension. Good extension.
yeah.
all we need now is to get Jenny Woodward to say it, and then on ABC weather, and
Yeah.
that'll be good.
There you go.
I mean, I use the
we
bomb
listen
site.
to Channel 7 because that has a local. Because up here,
Oh yeah.
as
No.
Chelsea would know, the rain varies from Malanda, which is only 10 k's away, 15 k's away, to Yungaburra to Mariba.
It will do.
Not to
Yeah.
mention-
Oh, especially from. Thank you guys so much for this
Thank you.
opportunity. I really appreciate it, and it's always interesting to hear your feedback and your ideas and all of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you, Chelsea.